Hello and welcome back to the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is you're doing. For the free wire tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share with you another take on my prong setting design. This is a hexagon wrap pendant. I'll show you that on the board in just a second a little bit more closely, and it features my super lazy wrap design for the bail. Sometimes I can spend more time on the bail than I do on the pendant, so for today's design I'm going to show you the fastest possible way you can finish a bail with 4 strands of wire. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look at the project we'll work together on today. So we're going to work with a 14mm sided amethyst hexagon for today's tutorial, and these have very soft facets front and back, so they can be dual faced. The design I'm going to share with you is the wrap using my basic prong setting design, but creating a dual-faced pendant. Now it does feature a slightly different aspect on the back than it does on the front, but I'm also going to show you that super lazy wrap technique for creating a bail in literally a couple of minutes. So the key points here, we're going to learn how to measure, and I know that I normally just say let's wing it when it comes to measuring things, but for today's tutorial we are actually going to be quite precise with our measurements. So I have a steel rule here which has millimeters along one surface. Now I know that from point to point, soft as they are, these hexagons measure 14 millimeters. I will pop a link in to those if you wish to purchase one that's exactly the same, and then you can follow along with me. So I'm going to pop that down for a second. Here is my ancient ruler, which I have had since forever, and that's what I'm going to use to create those very precise measurements. I'll get back to that in just a second. Let's take a closer look at the pendant very quickly. So we've got a twisted bail up at the top featuring 4 strands of wire and some swooshes to the front and a slightly cleaner look to the other side. As is usual with my work, I tend to keep these dual-faced where I possibly can. Sometimes the gemstone itself will want to have 2 different looks depending on which face you're sort of putting forwards. So you do have a drill hole in these, but I'm not using them at all. I know when I first started wire wrapping, I desperately wanted to get gems with drill holes so I could add myself a little security blanket. With this technique you don't need to use it, but if you really wanted to, you absolutely could. I'm just going to pop that up in the top right corner for now so you can refer to it if you need to, and talk about the first stage of our tutorial today. Wires we're going to need are 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and you'll need 2 lengths of approximately 14 to 15 inches each. What we're going to do is warm those through thoroughly before we get going, and as I say, you'll need 2 of those and repeat basically the same technique twice. So I'm only going to show it to you once because I'm sure you have a tolerance for my voice. So let's get that toasty warm. I will quickly introduce you to the other wire that we'll be using, which is 0.4mm, which is equivalent to 26 gauge, and I'll be working with that off the reel as it creates less waste. So let's get cracking with the first part of today's tutorial. Now for one time I'm going to put down my trusty bent chain nose pliers and pick up some straight tapered chain nose pliers. Now I have popped a very small mark on the ends of these to define the length of my prongs. During work it has sort of worn away, so I'm just going to pop that back on, and I'm going to make it just a little bit under halfway along those tapered plier ends, and that will just enable me to get similarly sized prongs each time I create a bend in the wire. So to give you a heads up, this is what we're working towards, which is a strand of that wire that we just talked about with 5 upright prongs. Now each prong for me measures approximately from the baseline to the tip of the prong about 5mm. So that's the point at which my pliers have been marked up. It's about 5mm. And I will be switching between imperial and metric measurements today because it's how my mind works for wire. I'm going to start about 4 inches, which is approximately 10 centimetres, from one end of that wire and start with my first right angle bend. I'm just going to flip the wire around as I work towards the right slightly better. And what I'm going to do is use my plier mark just here to define the distance of my first prong. So you can see that I'm holding the wire in the pliers at the line where that mark occurs. I'm going to push that angle directly up. We're at 90 degrees here, and push that over. I'm going to drop it back down to the board so you can see exactly what we're doing. So we've got like a funky Z bend going on at the moment. What we're looking for is right angles at this stage. What I'm then going to do is just support the wire on that first prong, or the first half of the prong rather, and start pushing down the long tail of the wire. If you're left dominant, you may wish to work towards the left, but it doesn't really matter which way you go, as long as you're starting 4 inches from the end and working along the longer end of wire. What I'm going to do is just bring the longer tail of wire now down, so that we get this funky shape. It looks for all the world like a gizmo rod. Once I've got that shape in position, what I need to do now is tighten up this little U shape until it becomes a nice firm set prong shape. So the way that I do this is to use quite a broad side of my pliers and just gently, in a couple of moves, start pushing that down. Now you'll see that the greatest resistance is at the curving end of that wire. And what we want to do is to squash those two sides together. So you can either use a set of pliers just on this section, holding everything flat, but I find that using my fingers will give you a better viewing. So let's just squish down this U shape on the end now, and I'm just going to go squish, squish, squish in small movements until that's nice and flat. What can happen is that one of these wires will end up on top of the other. I'm going to do the next one as poorly as I possibly can, and I'll show you how you can rescue it. What we're looking for is for everything to be flat, as if it's between 2 panes of glass. So it needs to go down on the board and be flat and smooth. It's incredibly cold here today, so my rings are spinning like good uns. What we need to do now is take this wire, the long tail of wire, and bring it out at another 90 degree angle, or a right angle. And there are 2 ways that you can do this. My preference is to support the prong that we've created inside the pliers, hold that very gently and push the wire up and against those pliers. Just twonked the camera. That's not very good, is it? So let's just pop that down on the board, and what we're looking for is to have those prongs coming away at 90 degrees. So if I draw that prong until it sits perfectly on the baseline, it needs to go all the way along in a nice straight line, and then up, back down, squish together, and then continue on its way. Now is the time that we need to add in that ruler. So I'm going to bring in my scruffy aged ruler. Now, because my shape that I'm working with is 14 millimeters point to point, albeit they're soft points, I'm going to add 1 millimeter to take account for the wire itself bending around the corner. Now, I've been practicing this literally all day today. It's a design I first made about 7 years ago, and I haven't revisited it because I didn't have very much fun, if I'm honest. So I've been trying to come up with a way that will be really lovely for people who are perhaps newer to wire work to work with. So I want the start line on my ruler to be central in that first prong that we created. I'm going to push that down onto the ruler, and then I'm going to go to the 15 millimeter mark, use my pliers to just hold on that 15 millimeter mark, and then I'm going to lift this up and put my nails against where that 15 millimeter mark is. What you may prefer to do is simply move along with a marker pen and then make that turn at the marker pen shape. What I'm going to do is put my pliers in, and I know that that is on the correct position, and I'm just going to push that up so that I'm working now on my second prong. So we've made our first prong, we've put in a 15 millimeter distance, and then the next prong is going to come up. So I'm going to do this one really quite poorly and show you how you can rescue it. What I would say is every time you're at this stage, the start of the next prong, pop it down onto your ruler and make sure that it fits where you want it to. Now, you may not be able to see, but this is just slightly too far over. I want the central part of the prong to sit on the line. So if you are very close up, you might be able to see that I am just about 1 millimeter too far along in this direction. So if I want to rescue this, Let me get the ruler out of the way for a second, moving the whole board obviously. What I'm going to do is just put those pliers in at the very, very corner of that bend, and I'm just going to nibble along by moving the pliers very, very small amounts, like so. And then we're going to bring that ruler back into position. And if you have very eagle eyes, you will see that we've moved that along just enough so that it now sits centrally on that 15mm mark. So I'm now going to put my second prong in, and I'm going to do it quite poorly so that we can rescue it as we go. Bearing in mind, there's my mark. It's about 5mm across at this stage. Pop that in, and then I'm going to push the wire across so I get that Z bend shape. Support the first half of the prong and bring that back down. Now you can see that that's not quite the same height as the first one because I accidentally, on purpose, moved my pliers so that it was slightly above that mark. Now if that happens at this stage and you can see it, just open it back out a little bit, pop the plier tips in, and you can just inch away, well not literal inches, tiny fractions of a millimetre, and just get that to sit exactly how you want it to. So I'm going to pop those pliers in and just open and close them until the bend is moved up slightly. Then I'm going to push that as yet unsquished prong into position, and then I'm going to close the pliers a couple of times, supporting everything so that it doesn't cross over until I get a prong. Now if I don't support it properly, you'll see that the wire has twisted over the top. We definitely don't want that. So if that happens, just grip it on the prong part, not where the wires are crossed over. Grip it on the prong part and just bring it back to true. And then just flatten everything down and then give it a good old squish when you're happy that it's sitting where you need it to. So I showed you a technique earlier about holding the prong gently and then pushing the tail of wire upwards. There is an alternative way, and you must find the way that makes you happy. So the second way is to put the pliers on the long tail of wire coming away and actually move that prong, like so. It's a little bit hard on the thumbs, but your end result is exactly the same. So we're looking to repeat this same process until you have 5 prongs. Now the ideal situation is to create 2 pieces of wire like this before you move on to the next stage. So I've quickly whizzed along and I've made 2 sections that are pretty much identical with 14 to 15 inches of that 1mm or 18 gauge wire. If they are slightly different, don't fret, because you won't really be able to see the both faces at the same time. It'll be absolutely fine. I do have one of my earlier attempts to show you at the end of today's tutorial to show you how it can go a little bit awry. So let's head back to the board and move on to the next stage of today's tutorial. So we now have our 2 strands of wire with those 5 little peaks in them. I'm going to show you on one of these what to do next, and pop the other one out of the way. Now for this procedure I found it easier to use 2 sets of pliers. I have these very elderly, very simple and inexpensive, very broad tipped pliers, which I'm going to put about 1/3 of the way up each of those prongs and grip centrally. So if I just hold that and show you, we're covering around about or less than 1/3 of the way up the prong, but we're supporting fully across the baseline. So the baseline travels all the way along with the prongs coming away. And what we're going to do is bring this around at the top to around a 90-degree angle. So if I just bring that up towards the camera, we're looking to replicate that same manoeuvre all the way along. So I'm going to just run through that quite quickly. If you apply a reasonable amount of pressure on that baseline, you should be able to retain a straight line all the way along. Now if you don't have 2 sets of pliers, don't worry. You should be able to use your chain nose pliers as well to just turn that end over. It's just nice if you've got 2 straight pliers to be able to do this smoothly. So again, each tip is just going to be tilted over, and whilst I'm holding less than 1/3 of the prong with the heavier pliers, it's really only just over half of the prong that tips over the top. So we're just going to push that firmly against the tip of the heavy pliers, And what you'll see when I drop this down to the board in a second is it starts to curve around slightly inwards. That's fine, it's par for the course and it's natural for this design. So if I flip that last one up and over, I can show you that that does indeed start to generate a curve. Now hopefully you'll be able to see that these are not all the same. If you take a look at those on the board, you might be able to notice that this one isn't strongly enough bent over. So you do want them all to be the same kind of placement. So I'm just going to re-straighten that baseline and pop back in with my finer tapered chain nose pliers and just draw that around until it does what I want. And eventually they all get to be about the same. Now you'll need to do that twice, and it's ideal to get them both done before you move on to the next stage, but I will just grab my piece into position. Now because this does have a drill hole, I'm going to sit this drill hole up at the top of the design so that I can hide it with some swirls on that easiest ever lazy veil. So what we're going to do now is start bending the wire around. Now you've got two pieces of wire going in to each of those little prongs, and what we want to do is take a section of the bend that needs to happen to either side. So what I'm going to do here is grip the right hand side of that prong, which is a single wire, and make a very small movement. Then I will grip on the left hand side of that prong and make the same kind of movement. So you're getting an angle, but you're spreading the angle between both sides of the prong. Sometimes it's slightly uneven, but you can very simply adjust that. So looking at it from the other way, if I grip the first half of the prong, like so, and make a small angle bend, grip the second half of the prong and make another small angle bend. So I am not good at maths, I'm not good at the triangle-y stuff, but if there's 360 degrees, we divide that by 6. So you've got each angle, there are 6 angles on the frame, and then you divide that into 2. That's the number of degrees that you need to be applying to each of those prongs. Now that's far too much like science, so I am just going to lift this up slightly and put half an angle in on the one side, half an angle in on the other side, and I'm going to repeat that all the way around until it looks even. So I will show you the whole process actually. This one hasn't been done, so half a little bend here, half a little bend on the second side of that prong, and the last one, that's probably a good angle to see it from actually. I've said angle again, oh no. So what I want to do is apply a bit of a bend on the first half of the prong and a bit of a bend on the second half of the prong. Now ideally we're looking to keep these straight lines straight in all dimensions. So what you may need to do is just nibble along with any flat facing pliers to keep it flat to the desk. So I'll do that before we finalise the shape, but we will also want to keep it straight as well. So you may need to, from multiple angles, just to keep each of those straight lines straight between where we've put those angles in. Now you can see that I haven't done anywhere nearly enough bending just yet, and the way to get this particular piece to look as beautiful as possible is to spend time on the angles. Now at this stage I'm tempted to switch over to my very familiar pliers. They're really good in the hand and I'm able to kind of control them in a way that I don't get with other pliers. So it's just a case of making small adjustments all the way around. You may need to straighten the prongs bases as you go. I'm just going to put a bit more angle on this one. And what we're looking for, keep those lines straight. As we move around, is we're looking for the 2 lines at the top to cross over, and those 2 lines here and here need to be the same sort of length as the side pieces here. So this is a very boring process, but it's a case of nibbling, keeping it straight, moving it. I'm just going to speed through it so you can see what the end result should look like. Bit of a squish there. Make sure that this line is straight here. And you may at some point as well also just need to bring those prongs down a little bit so that they keep that 90-degree bend. And eventually what you will end up with is a shape that fits your hexagon. Let's find that drill aperture. Almost perfectly. So I'm not going to faff around too much with the finesse here, but you will obviously want to spend extra time. Keep these lines straight, get the angles right to fit your hexagon. What we're looking to have is the two last prongs on those upper shoulder angles. And then in the centre, what we're going to do is bend the wires up and out of the way, just to the left and just to the right of that central peak. Like so. And you'll need to do that twice to make sure that you can encompass your design. So I will spend a bit of time now recreating the second half of this design and also making sure that everything fits together, and I'll join you back in a second. So that was by far and away the most time-consuming part of this tutorial, and that's to get two matching halves with nice right-angle bend prongs. Everything is completely flat on that baseline, and we've got them to match up, and they fit around the piece that we're going to work with today, which is a hexagon of amethyst. So if you'd like to join me back down at the board, I'll show you what we're going to do next. So I have been at great pains to make sure that these sit as flat as possible against the desk. Those prongs are all heading over the surface at around about 90 degrees, and that my gemstone in question actually fits inside the frame. So you can see I've replicated reasonably well those angles. You can obviously take even more time than I have to make that as perfect as you desire. And we're just going to straighten these until they sit flat. It's flat enough for demonstration purposes. Another thing that I have done is just put a little bit of warmth into these wires up at the top, like so, and just splayed them apart slightly, and that's on both of them. We're going to need that to be nice and warm and smooth when we're making our easiest ever lazy wraparound bail, but it's also helpful to have them just splaying out slightly when we go on to the next stage of our tutorial, which uses wire on the reel. Now I keep it on the reel because I'm never quite sure how much I want to do with the wire wrapping. Now I will just show you before we get going, this is a 0.4 gauge or 26 gauge wire. And what I've done is a little bit of limited wrapping around the edge. I've got 3 bars at one side and then a long lazy wrap, 3 bars, a lazy wrap underneath, and then 3 bars, a lazy wrap, and 3 at the top, which are currently hidden by that lazy wraparound bail. The reason I suggest using your wire off the reel is because if you wanted to absolutely fill every moment of those 2 sections that we're about to draw together with wire, it will look absolutely stunning. However, I don't want to make a video that's 48 years long that you get bored of. So the reason I say to use the wire on the reel is because it gives you the choices. I'm going to try and find another piece that I made earlier, although I think it went into the bin in the end. And what I'd done is I'd just done some lazy wraps around the outside and it looked hideous. And then I tried doing a back and forth figure of 8 weave all the way along and it looked hideous. So you can either completely fill these sections with that finer gauge wire wrapping, or you can do what I've done and put a little bit of a pattern into it, which is quite attractive, still looks lovely, but doesn't take forever and a day. So let's just have a look at what we're going to do next. I've got my 2 halves with those prongs sitting around about 90 degrees, give or take, and I'm just going to join them together back to back. Now they will want to wiggle around and be annoying. If you used the ruler and you got this as straight as possible, you will be able to line up those prongs all the way around and it will look beautiful. If you didn't quite get that right, don't worry about it, you're only going to be looking at one side at a time. So what I'm going to do now, I've done a lot of pressing of these wires to keep these edges straight and to ensure that my prongs sit in the orientation I want them to. So what you will see is the prongs need to be facing each other on opposite sides and the base needs to be pointing up to that bail section. So once you've got all of those prongs in the right place, this wire is actually quite hard, and if I very gently prise that apart a little bit, not much, just a little bit, makes life so much easier. So what I tend to do is unspool about a foot of wire to begin with. I might just move this over to the other side for a second. Let's put that big piece there as well. I've unspooled about a foot of wire, and what I'm going to do is start by showing you the pattern I did on my pendant, which is to wrap 3 times close to the prongs. In fact, we'll start on this side. So if I take the wire down that central section, and what I'm going to do here, what will happen is it will catch on all of the prongs and everything is really joyful when you're trying to demonstrate. We're not going to worry about it. I'm just going to pinch the long tail of the wire that's still attached to the reel. I might put that on the other side and out of the way. And then I'm going to bring that tail all the way around so I get 3 visible wraps just to the left of those 2 prongs. My 2 prong sections are back to back. There's my 3rd wrap, and then I'm crossing underneath. So inside the little clamshell that we're making, I've got a diagonal pass of the tail of wire, and this is the cut end of the wire. And then I'm going to pass that to the far side of the prong section, and then wrap 3 times. 1, keeping those 2 pronged sections back to back. You can again open those wires out slightly, just very, very gently warming them as you go. And I'm going to keep these 2 prong sections of wire tightly together, one on top of the other. So I've got now 3 visible wraps just to the right of that first prong. And then I'm going to draw a lazy long line of that finer gauge wire underneath or on the inside of that prong back to back. And then I'm going to pinch at the far end and wrap 3 times just before the angle changes. That's 1, that's 2, and that is 3. So I've got loads of wire at this end left to work with, but also that foot that we unspooled would have been enough to completely fill this section with wire wrapping. I just don't have the time or the will to spend that many hours wrapping the whole thing. What I'm going to do now is flip side. So I'm going to pop that down for a second, take the wire over to the other side and show you how to do this in reverse. So I'm pinching the whole assembly together. I've got those 3 neat little bars up next to the prong. It's to the right of the prong now because I've inverted it. And I'm going to take a long, lazy sideways or diagonal across underneath before wrapping 3 times just to the left of the prong. Now what you'll find, because you're working on the reel, is that it's just a little bit fiddly. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the wire over the top, up between those 2 sets of long, tall tail wire at the top. That's the 3rd visible wrap. So I bring the tail of the wire that's connected to the reel. This hand is holding the wire connected to the reel. Bring that back down into view. Diagonal underneath those prongs. And then I'm going to wrap 3 times again, bringing those 2 sections of prong set wire back to back all the time. And you'll see that that's not a perfect match, but I'm not going to worry about it. That's 1 wrap already. Let's take a 2nd wrap. Draw that up between the gap at the top. 2 wraps, a 3rd wrap. Bring that tail all the way through and out. Long, lazy wrap across the back or the underside of those wires. And I'm going to wrap 3 times again adjacent to the prong. 1, that's 2. And then a 3rd time. So I'm going to flip the assembly over now, which takes it out of shot for a second. And you can see I've got those 3 wraps to the left of the prong. Little sideways stripe of wire, and then I'm going to wrap 3 times, diagonal underneath, 3 times, diagonal underneath, 3 times, all the way around until I get to the end, and that is where I will rejoin you in just a second. So I've just spent a couple of minutes doing the wrapping in the sequence I explained. It does look really beautiful if you simply wrap all the way around. So between the 2 prongs, you'll just wrap, 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 filling every spare millimetre with that finer gauge wire, diagonal cross underneath the prong every time, and then wrap, wrap, wrap all the way around, but like 6 times. I've left a tail of wire on either end because it gives me options of how I'm going to tie the bail together. So if you'd like to join me back down at the board, we'll move on to the next step. So I've woven my 2 halves together of those prong set hexagonal shaped wires. And I've splayed out those 4 wires coming up at the top, which we're going to use for the easiest ever lazy bail. Now it does pay to polish the fingerprints off your gemstone before you insert it into the housing. And I'm just going to sit that in with the drill hole up at the top because it means I can cover it with swirls if I want to. Now what we need to do is just be happy with all of our angles, make sure that our prongs are facing each other at those special points. make sure that you're overall happy with the design. Like I say, it would look really pretty if you just wove all the way along those lines. So I've got a tail of wire on both sides. I don't really need that on both sides, but I'm just going to leave that hanging out at the top so that in case I change my mind, because, you know, that's the prerogative that we have. So I have one tail of finer gauge wire over here for the moment. What I need to do basically is tie everything together. Now what I did with my piece of design from earlier on is I simply wrapped 3 times around one section of wire, change direction 3 times around the next section of wire, change direction 3 times around the next, change direction 3 times around the last before returning to the first again. Now it gives it a really strong base, but it may help you just to very gently turn those 4 wires so that they're all facing in opposite directions to one another. So let's just flip this over. I've got a tail of wire coming off of this section of upright. So what I'm going to do is push the whole frame together, flip the direction, so I've come underneath this wire. So that means I want to go over the top and around the next one. So I'm going to just very, very carefully pull the wire around that one, draw it down to the base, so that's one wrap, pull the wire around for a second wrap, and then my third wrap. So if I just pull that through for the moment, scooch those 3 wires down. The next wire in rotation, I'm going to go around like so. So I'm just going to draw the wire from underneath this wire that we just wrapped, and I'm going to take that, let's have a look. No, it's coming over the top of this wire, so I need to take it underneath the next one in the rotation and around. So that's 1 around here, 2 around here, and then 3 around that wire. I'm going to turn it through 90 degrees. Let me just tighten up that little coil set there. So you can see at the moment we haven't joined these 2 wires, so I'm going to do that right now. The finer gauge wire has come from underneath this one, so I'm going to take it over the next one in the rotation. So up and around, that's 1 wrap, 2 wrap, and then the third wrap essentially takes my wire down the centre, and I'm going to bring it, because it's come over the top of this one, underneath the next one in rotation. So you're always switching. It's like doing a little figure of 8, but you're not going back on yourself. So that's 1, 2 and 3. Tighten up each of these wraps as we move around, and then we're coming back to our starting place. So the wire has come from underneath this one, so the next adjacent one, it needs to go over the top, and I'm going to pull that quite tightly to just knot everything together. So you can simply, if this is beyond you or you don't want to, you can just wrap around and around and around the whole bundle of 4 wires until everything is definitely passing that ever important shake test. So what I'm going to do is run around the whole sequence another couple of times until I have 2 wraps on each of those wires. So I'm going to come underneath this one. Wait a minute, that was a 4th wrap. There we go. Underneath this one. Oops-a-daisy, there goes the camera. 1 and 2 and 3. It wouldn't be a Jem Hawkes tutorial if I didn't knock something on the floor or hit a camera. So what we're going to do is 1 and 2 and 3 underneath the next one. Bring that all the way around. Am I going in the right direction? Yes, I am. So I've come over the top of this one. I need to go underneath the next one. 1 and 2 and 3. Let's have a look on that last wire. I've already completed 2 wraps on every single one of those 4 uprights. So I'm just going to splay those out apart for a second to enable me to get right inside the gubbins of this section. Trim that last little tail of wire away. So just making sure that that's neat and tidy, and that all of those coils are as low down as they possibly can be. So I don't think I need this piece of wire, but you have a second piece here, and if you're nervous at all about your design, or you want that extra added insurance, you have the option to pass it through that drill hole on this beautiful amethyst hexagon and draw it back up almost anywhere on the design. So I can see I've got an access point here, so I'm going to pop my wire through there and pull it nice and firmly and tie off with 3 little wraps on the end. Now this is not a piece that is going to be on show, so the essence of what we're doing right now is about strength of design, making things safe, and it's not about the aesthetics of the end product. So let's just put that through one more time, bring that nice and neatly up, and then let's trim away that excess of wire. It's always good to have an escape plan just in case you want to add some security. I'm just going to take that very end and just push it down. So the next thing that I want to do is organise my 4 upright wires to create that super lazy bail. So I think this looks like the best order of arrangement. If you're struggling with that, you can give them a quick squish, very, very gently, bring them all back together, make it nice and smooth, and generally speaking, it will tell you what order it best thinks that those wires should lie in. What we're looking for is for them to be quite neat and tidy, basically. So bringing those wraps that tie everything together and make that nice and secure all the way as far down as you can, and then heating those 4 wires side by side. So at this point you can choose if you have a preferred side. You may sometimes find that the prongs are just a little bit neater on one side. I think this is the face that I want to go with. You may also feel that perhaps there's a prettier side to the gemstone, which I think is actually this side, but never mind, we're going to go with this side. So I'm smoothing those 4 wires together really, really neatly. They need to be side by side and they need to be super warm and malleable. So I'm going to grab a marker pen. You could use a ring mandrel if you have one that goes down small enough. Not a ring mandrel, sorry, just like a round form that is not tapered. It does need to be the same kind of size. I don't think that my bail makers are actually the size that I want to use, but you could use bail makers. So I'm going to put my marker pen in. If I pop this down on the board, you'll see that at the moment my 4 upright wires are pretty much straight out the top of that pendant. So I'm going to just allow the wires to bend around my marker pen, trying to keep them nice and together at this stage. You can see they've actually split. If that's what they want to do, I'm going to let them. It has its own aesthetic value. If you don't want them to do that, undo where you were at. Let's warm those wires back through until they're straight and smooth and flat again. And then we can go again and keep them side by side. So we've just superheated that by hand. I'm going to draw those wires over the top. Now you can see that they're all 4 are nice side by side like a giant superhighway. And I'm going to take the whole thing around the back and push them so that they nestle around the neck area. So I'm going to bring that up slightly so that I can get at least one good wrap with that superhighway of 4 wires around the neck of the bail. You might need a little bit of plier and tool assistance at this stage just to keep everything neat and tidy. And then I'm going to bring that across the back. At this stage, I just want to make sure that it's safe for me to remove my marker pen and I can actually get that back in and out really neatly and easily, and that's going to accept almost any chain or ribbon that you want to use. Everything is now super sturdy and tidy. So what I'm going to do is decide what I want to do with these tails. I'll probably bring that one down in a coil. I'll probably bring the next one along down slightly further over. I might bring this one up in a coil, and this one, let's just see if we can get that to sit neatly in that little highway bundle. And I might bring that across the back and just make a teeny tiny coil out of this one, or like I did on this one, you could simply trim it away and hide it inside the design. You don't have to have coils everywhere, I just happen to like them. So I'm going to make a teeny tiny coil just here and pop that over the top of the rear drill hole. And then with these, I'm just going to do the same kind of thing. So you could really just take an extra moment to make sure that there aren't any jagged ends on here. I didn't on the back, but I was quite short on wire, so I'm not going to stress. Let's take the fine end of your round nose pliers and just pop a couple of little coils over the surface, making sure that you don't stab the gemstone in the process. So I've started the coil here. You can obviously take a lot more time and get that super neat and tidy. And I'm going to put that one down over the centre, and then I might take the next one slightly further over, or I can just move that a little bit higher. The other one you could have going the other way if you wanted to. At this stage you're just kind of playing with coils, and that's one of my favourite things to do. But you can see how quickly this very, very cheaty, super fast, easiest ever bail makes up. It's not one that I tend to do very often, and I tend to spend hours and hours on end weaving my bails. But if you want to make something, because you spent so long making the pendant already, if you want to make something a little bit more quick, then this might be the answer. So let's just tighten up that coil, rotate it around. The art of coiling is in taking time to do it, which I'm obviously not taking the hugest amount of time today. Now you can sit that up against that swirling bail if you want to. I actually think I might have another cluster over the top and see what that looks like coming down instead. If you warm that wire essentially first, then you will have many, many more choices later. So that will fit on pretty much any stringing medium that you like. So you've got a couple there to choose from. That's not the most attractive piece of jewellery marketing ever. So let's take that back out of the way. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed my hexagon wrap pendant tutorial, complete with that easiest ever lazy bail. Beautiful amethyst to work with today. As ever, I've used raw copper, but you can use whatever metals you like. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I hope to see you back here on the Jem Hawkes YouTube channel very, very soon. Bye for now.